When I woke up this morning, I never imagined I'd be sitting here telling you this story. But sometimes, life has a way of teaching people lessons they never saw coming. And honey, let me tell you, this is one of those stories that will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty. My name is Dorothy, and I'm 73 years old. I've seen a lot in my time on this earth, raised 4 children, mostly on my own after my husband passed when they were young, and I thought I knew what real heartbreak looked like. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what my own daughter-in-law would put me through just 2 days ago. You see, for the past 8 months, I had been planning what I thought would be the most beautiful wedding for my youngest son, Marcus, and his fiancée, Jessica now. Marcus has always been my baby, even though he's 31 years old now. After his father died, he was only 12, and we developed this special bond that I treasured more than anything in this world. When he told me he was getting engaged to Jessica 3 years ago, I was over the moon. Jessica seemed sweet enough at first. She was polite, always said the right things, and Marcus was absolutely head over heels for her. But looking back now, I realize there were signs I chose to ignore. Little comments here and there about how I was too involved in their relationship, or how I needed to understand that things would be different once they were married. I brushed it off, thinking it was just normal adjustment period jitters. When they got engaged, Jessica's parents made it very clear from the beginning that they wouldn't be contributing much to the wedding. Her father had been laid off from his job, and her mother was dealing with some serious health issues that were draining their savings. I could see the stress this was causing Marcus, watching him work double shifts, trying to figure out how they were going to afford the wedding Jessica had been dreaming about since she was a little girl. That's when I made the decision that I thought was coming from love. I told Marcus I wanted to pay for their wedding, not just contribute to it, mind you, but pay for the entire thing, the venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, the dress, everything. I had been saving money for years, living modestly, and I had a nest egg that I figured was better spent on making my son happy than sitting in a bank account. Marcus was hesitant at first, saying it was too much, but I insisted. I told him this was my gift to them, my way of making sure they started their marriage without the burden of debt hanging over their heads. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed thrilled. Suddenly, she was full of ideas about upgrading this and adding that, and I happily went along with every single request. Over the next several months, I spent countless hours with wedding planners, visiting venues, tasting cakes, and coordinating with vendors. I put everything in my name, because I was the one writing the checks. The Riverside Manor, where the reception was going to be held, became like a second home to me. The staff knew me by name, and I felt so proud, knowing that I was creating something beautiful for my son's special day. But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. Jessica began making comments about how I was getting too involved, how she needed space to make her own decisions. She started excluding me from meetings with vendors, saying she wanted to handle certain aspects herself. I tried to be understanding, thinking maybe I had been a bit overwhelming in my enthusiasm. The real trouble started about 3 weeks ago. We were having a final fitting for Jessica's dress, and I made what I thought was an innocent comment about how beautiful she looked and how proud Marcus's father would have been to see this day. Jessica's entire demeanor changed. She got this cold look in her eyes and said, I needed to stop making everything about my dead husband and my feelings. I was stunned. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to make anything about me, that I was just expressing how happy I was for them both, but Jessica cut me off and said she was tired of me inserting myself into every aspect of their wedding, that I was embarrassing and irrelevant, and that she wished I would just write the checks and stay out of the way. Those words hit me like a physical blow. Embarrassing and irrelevant. After everything I had done, after all the love and money and time I had poured into making their dream wedding happen, that's what she really thought of me. I left the dress shop that day, feeling more hurt than I had felt since my husband's funeral. But it got worse, much worse. 2 days later, Marcus called me with news that made my blood run cold. He said Jessica had been thinking things over, and they had decided it would be better if I didn't attend the wedding ceremony. They were worried that my presence might cause drama, and they wanted their special day to be perfect and stress-free. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was uninviting me from his wedding. When I asked him to explain, he stumbled over his words, clearly uncomfortable, but he kept repeating that this was what Jessica wanted and that he needed to support his future wife. I asked him if he realized that I had paid for everything, that without me, there would be no wedding at all. He said he understood that, and he was grateful, but that Jessica felt my presence would be disruptive. He actually used the word disruptive to describe his own mother attending his wedding. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had raised my children, where I had comforted them through heartbreaks and celebrated their successes, and I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't just being excluded from a party. I was being erased from one of the most important moments in my son's life by a woman who saw me as nothing more than a checkbook. Jessica had made it clear that she considered me embarrassing and irrelevant. She wanted my money, but not my presence. She was perfectly happy to let me fund her fairy tale wedding, while treating me like some kind of unwanted relative who needed to be managed and controlled. For 24 hours, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to just accept it, to swallow my pride and let them have their perfect day, even if it meant I would be sitting at home while my son got married with money I had provided. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that accepting this treatment would be betraying not just myself, but every mother who had ever been taken for granted by ungrateful children. I thought about my late husband, about how he would have handled this situation. He was a man who believed in consequences, who taught our children that actions have results and that respect is earned, not demanded. He never would have stood for this level of disrespect, especially not from someone who was supposed to be joining our family. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. If Jessica truly believed I was embarrassing and irrelevant, then she could have her wedding without any trace of my embarrassing, irrelevant involvement. If I wasn't welcome at the celebration, then my money wasn't welcome either. So I spent yesterday morning making phone calls. First to the venue, then to the caterer, then to the florist, the photographer, and every single vendor involved in what was supposed to be Marcus and Jessica's dream wedding. One by one, I canceled every contract that was in my name, which, as it turned out, was every single aspect of their celebration. The woman at Riverside Manor seemed confused when I called. She asked if there was a problem with the date, or if we needed to make changes. I simply told her that due to family circumstances, we would be canceling the entire event. She tried to explain the cancellation fees and penalties, but I told her I understood and that I would handle whatever charges were necessary. By noon yesterday, the wedding that Jessica had spent months planning The wedding she considered too good for my embarrassing and irrelevant presence no longer existed. Every vendor had been notified, every contract had been terminated, and every deposit had been forfeited. I felt a strange sense of calm as I made those calls. For months, I had been stressed about details, worried about timing, anxious about making sure everything was perfect for Jessica's big day. But as I systematically dismantled the wedding she had built on my generosity, while excluding me from witnessing it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt powerful. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You might think I was being petty or vindictive. You might think I should have been the bigger person and just accepted being treated poorly for the sake of keeping the peace. But let me ask you something. How many times should a person accept being disrespected by people they love? How many times should someone be expected to fund their own humiliation? I had given Jessica everything she asked for. I had opened my wallet and my heart, and in return, she had made it clear that while she wanted my money, she didn't want me. She had convinced my son to exclude his own mother from his wedding because she found my presence inconvenient. Well, as of yesterday afternoon, Jessica learned something very important about consequences. She learned that when you treat people like they're disposable, sometimes they actually dispose of themselves. And when that person happens to be the one funding your entire fantasy, the disposal comes with a very hefty price tag. I haven't heard from Marcus yet, but I have a feeling that conversation is coming very soon. Jessica, on the other hand, has been calling my phone nonstop since last night. I can see her name lighting up my screen every few minutes, but I haven't answered yet. I figure if I was irrelevant enough to be banned from the wedding, then I'm probably too irrelevant to take her phone calls right now. The wedding was supposed to be tomorrow. I wonder what Jessica is going to tell all those guests who are expecting to celebrate at a venue that no longer has their reservation, with food that's no longer been ordered, and flowers that will never be delivered. I wonder if she still thinks I'm irrelevant, now that she's scrambling to figure out how to explain to everyone why the wedding they were invited to no longer exists. But this story is far from over, because what happened next is going to show Jessica exactly how relevant one embarrassing old woman can be when she's pushed too far. This morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Every single one of them was from Jessica. And let me tell you, the desperation in those messages was something to behold. The same woman who had called me embarrassing and irrelevant just days ago was now begging me to call her back, saying we needed to talk urgently about the wedding arrangements. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you about the phone call that started this whole mess, because that conversation is what really showed me who Jessica truly was, underneath all that fake sweetness she had been putting on for 3 years. It was last Tuesday evening when my phone rang. I was in my garden, tending to the roses that my late husband had planted for me 25 years ago. These roses have survived storms, droughts, and harsh winters, just like I have. When I saw Marcus's name on my screen, I smiled, thinking he was calling to go over some last-minute wedding details. Instead, I heard Jessica's voice. She had taken Marcus's phone to call me, which should have been my first red flag. Her voice was different from the polite, sugary tone she usually used with me. This voice was cold, calculated, and completely devoid of the warmth she had been faking all this time. She told me they had been discussing the wedding guest list and seating arrangements, and there was a problem. According to Jessica, several of her friends and family members had expressed concerns about my behavior at recent wedding events. She claimed that I had been too emotional at the bridal shower, that I had monopolized conversations with vendors, and that my presence was making people uncomfortable. I stood there in my garden, holding that phone, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. I asked her what specific behavior she was referring to, because I genuinely couldn't think of anything I had done that would be considered inappropriate. I had been nothing but supportive and generous throughout this entire process. That's when Jessica's mask completely slipped off. She said that the problem wasn't any one specific thing, but rather that I was simply too involved, too emotional, too present. She said that my generation didn't understand boundaries, and that I was making their wedding about my feelings instead of about their love story. Then she delivered the words that will be burned into my memory forever. She said that after careful consideration, they had decided it would be best for everyone if I didn't attend the wedding ceremony. She said I was welcome to contribute financially, of course, but that my physical presence would be disruptive to the peaceful, elegant atmosphere they were trying to create. I asked to speak to Marcus, and Jessica said he was in complete agreement with this decision. She said he was just too much of a mama's boy to tell me himself, but that he had given her permission to handle this conversation. She actually used those words, mama's boy, like it was something shameful that my son loved and respected me. When I finally did get Marcus on the phone, he sounded like a stranger. Gone was the warm, affectionate voice of the son who used to call me every Sunday, just to check in. Instead, I heard a man who had been completely manipulated by a woman who saw me as an obstacle to her perfect day. He mumbled some excuse about wanting a small, intimate ceremony, and how they thought I would be more comfortable celebrating with them at a later date. When I pressed him about whether this was really his idea, he got defensive and said that Jessica was going to be his wife, and he needed to support her decisions. That's when it hit me. My son, the boy I had raised to be strong and independent, had been turned into a puppet by a woman who had been planning my exclusion from the very beginning. All those months of smiling at me, accepting my money, letting me plan and pay for everything, she had been secretly resenting my involvement and planning to cut me out when it mattered most. After I hung up that phone, I sat on my back porch for hours, just thinking. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made over the years, working 2 jobs to keep my children fed and clothed after their father died, going without new clothes for myself so I could pay for Marcus's college tuition, staying up all night when he was sick, driving him to baseball practice every weekend, cheering from the stands at every game. See, I thought about the wedding dress shopping trips, where Jessica had insisted I come along to give my opinion, the cake tastings, where she had asked me to help her choose between flavors, the vendor meetings, where she had smiled and thanked me for my generosity. All of it had been an act, a performance, designed to keep the money flowing, while she secretly planned to erase me from the most important day of my son's life. But what really broke my heart was realizing that Marcus had let her do it. The son I had raised to stand up for what was right, to protect the people he loved, to have integrity and courage, had chosen to throw me away, rather than stand up to his fiancée. I spent that entire night awake, walking through my house, looking at pictures of Marcus growing up, his first day of school, his high school graduation, the day he got his first job. In every single one of those milestone moments, I had been there, not just present, but actively involved in making those moments special for him. Now, for his wedding, the biggest milestone of his adult life, I was being told I was too embarrassing and irrelevant to witness it. But my money was still perfectly acceptable. My financial contribution was welcome, even essential. But my emotional investment, my love, my pride in seeing my son get married, all of that was considered disruptive. By Thursday morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to fight them or beg them to reconsider. I wasn't going to try to convince Marcus that he was making a mistake or that Jessica was manipulating him. Instead, I was going to give them exactly what they had asked for. They wanted me out of their wedding? Fine. But if I was out, then everything that came with me was out too. I started making my calls around 9 in the morning. The first call was to Riverside Manor, the venue where the reception was supposed to take place. When I explained to the event coordinator that I needed to cancel the entire booking, she was shocked. She asked if there was a family emergency or if we needed to postpone to a different date. I simply told her that there had been a change in circumstances and that the event would no longer be taking place as planned. She tried to explain the cancellation fees, which were substantial, given how close we were to the wedding date. But I told her that wasn't a concern. I had already calculated that the financial loss from canceling everything would be significant. But it was a price I was willing to pay for my dignity. The catering company was next. They had already begun food preparation for the 150 guests who were expected to attend. Canceling meant losing not just the deposit, but paying for food that had already been ordered and partially prepared. Again, I accepted the charges without complaint. One by one, I called every vendor involved in what was supposed to be Marcus and Jessica's dream wedding. The florist who had spent weeks designing elaborate centerpieces, the photographer who had blocked out the entire weekend for their event, the musicians who had been practicing their special requests, the cake decorator who had been working on a custom 3-tier creation. With each phone call, I felt a strange sense of relief. For months, I had been carrying the stress of coordinating all these details, making sure everything was perfect for a day that I was now being told I couldn't even attend. As I systematically dismantled the wedding that had consumed my life for the past 8 months, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own story. The most satisfying call was to the dress shop where Jessica's gown was being held for final alterations. The dress had cost more than some people make in a month, and I had paid for every penny of it. When I told them that the wedding was canceled and they should release the dress only if Jessica could provide her own payment method, the silence on the other end of the line was telling. By Friday afternoon, the wedding that Jessica had been planning for months, the wedding she had deemed too special for my embarrassing presence, had been completely erased. Every contract canceled, every vendor notified, every arrangement terminated. I felt surprisingly calm as I sat in my living room that evening, knowing that tomorrow was supposed to be the wedding day. Instead of getting ready to watch my son get married, instead of putting on the mother of the groom dress I had carefully selected, I was sitting peacefully in my own home, free from the stress and heartache of being treated like a second-class citizen by people who were supposed to love me. That's when my phone started ringing. The first call came around 6 o'clock. Jessica's name appeared on my screen, but I didn't answer. Then another call, 10 minutes later, then another. By 8 o'clock, she was calling every few minutes, and the calls continued well into the night. This morning, when I finally looked at my phone, I saw the full extent of Jessica's panic. The text messages started around midnight and continued until dawn. At first, they were relatively polite. asking me to call her back because there was an urgent matter to discuss regarding the wedding. But as the hours passed and I didn't respond, the messages became increasingly desperate. She was asking about the venue booking, wondering if there had been some kind of miscommunication with the vendors. By 4 a.m, her messages were practically begging me to call her back, saying that people were starting to ask questions, and she didn't know what to tell them. The final message, sent just an hour before I woke up, was the most telling of all. Jessica had written that she realized there might have been some misunderstandings between us, and that she would love to sit down and talk things through like family. She said she hoped we could work together to make sure Marcus's special day went smoothly. Like family, the same woman who had told me I was embarrassing and irrelevant was now wanting to talk like family. The same woman who had convinced my son to uninvite his own mother from his wedding was now concerned about misunderstandings and working together. But here's the thing. Jessica didn't realize when she made the decision to exclude me from their wedding. When you build your dreams on someone else's foundation, you better make sure that foundation wants to keep supporting you. And when you treat the person holding up your entire fantasy like they're disposable, sometimes they decide to prove just how indispensable they really are. Dispensable they really are. Now, I can see exactly what kind of person Jessica really is. This morning's messages weren't just desperate. They were revealing. Each text showed me a woman who had never once considered that her actions might have consequences. She had spent so long thinking of me as just a resource to be managed, that she genuinely believed she could treat me however she wanted, and I would just accept it. The most pathetic part was how she kept trying to frame this as some kind of misunderstanding, as if calling your future mother-in-law embarrassing and irrelevant could somehow be misinterpreted, as if uninviting the woman who paid for your entire wedding could be seen as anything other than calculated cruelty. But what really got to me was that final message about talking like family. For 3 years, I had tried to treat Jessica like the daughter I never had. I had included her in family traditions, shared stories about Marcus's childhood, even given her some of my late husband's mother's jewelry as an early wedding gift. And the whole time, she had been silently cataloging every interaction as evidence of why I was too much, too involved, too embarrassing to be part of her special day. I decided to get dressed and go about my normal Saturday routine. If this was supposed to be my son's wedding day, then I was going to treat it like any other day. I wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for myself or wondering what might have been. Instead, I was going to enjoy the peace and quiet of a day without wedding stress. Around 10 a.m, I was having my second cup of coffee when there was a knock at my front door. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing on my porch, and he looked terrible. His hair was messy, his clothes were wrinkled, and he had the kind of exhausted expression that comes from a sleepless night filled with unpleasant realizations. When I opened the door, he immediately started talking, the words tumbling out in a rush. He said Jessica had been up all night making phone calls, trying to figure out what had happened with the wedding vendors. Apparently, she had spent hours on the phone with Riverside Manor, insisting there must have been some kind of mistake, that surely their booking was still valid. It wasn't until the venue manager finally explained that the person who had booked and paid for the event had personally canceled it, that Jessica began to understand the situation she had created for herself. Marcus said she had been calling vendors all night desperately trying to see if anything could be salvaged at the last minute. He stood there in my doorway, looking like a man who was finally beginning to wake up from a very expensive dream. He asked me if it was true that I had canceled everything, and when I confirmed that yes, I had terminated every contract that was in my name, I watched the full weight of the situation hit him. Marcus asked me why I would do such a thing, and I could hear Jessica's influence in the question. Even now, even after everything that had happened, he was still framing this as something I had done to them, rather than something they had done to me. I invited him in and sat him down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with his homework for 12 years, where we had shared countless meals and conversations. I asked him to tell me, in his own words, exactly what he and Jessica had decided about my role in their wedding. Watching him try to explain their decision was painful. He stumbled over his words, clearly uncomfortable with having to articulate what they had done. He kept using phrases like, "We thought it would be better," and "Jessica felt like it might be less stressful," without ever directly stating that they had uninvited me from my own son's wedding. Finally, I stopped him and asked a simple question. I asked him if he understood that when he chose to exclude me from his wedding, he was telling me that I wasn't important enough to witness the most significant moment of his adult life. I asked him if he realized that after paying for everything, after months of planning and preparation, I was being told that my presence was unwanted. That's when Marcus finally broke down. He put his head in his hands and started crying, really crying, like he hadn't done since he was a little boy. He said he knew they had made a terrible mistake, that Jessica had convinced him it was the right thing to do, but that he had been feeling sick about it ever since our phone conversation. He said Jessica had been telling him for months that I was too controlling, too emotional, too involved in their relationship. She had convinced him that the only way they could start their marriage on the right foot was to establish boundaries with me from the very beginning. She had made him believe that excluding me from the wedding was actually a kindness, a way to avoid drama and conflict. But now, sitting in my kitchen, looking at the pain in my eyes, Marcus was finally seeing the situation clearly. He was realizing that he had allowed his fiancée to manipulate him into betraying the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He was understanding that in choosing Jessica's comfort over my dignity, he had revealed something about himself that he didn't like. I let him cry for a while before I spoke. When I finally did, I told him something that I had been thinking about all night. I said that the saddest part of this whole situation wasn't the money I had lost canceling the wedding, or even the pain of being excluded from his special day. The saddest part was discovering that the son I had raised to be a man of integrity had allowed himself to become someone who would throw away the people who loved him for the sake of keeping the peace with someone who clearly didn't respect his family. Marcus looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and asked what he could do to fix this. He said he would call Jessica right now and tell her that the wedding was off unless I was included. He said he would demand that she apologize and make things right between us. But I shook my head and told him it was too late for that. The wedding they had planned was gone, and it couldn't be reconstructed in a day. More importantly, I said, the damage to our relationship couldn't be fixed with a last-minute apology or a grudging invitation. Jessica had shown me exactly what she thought of me, and Marcus had shown me that he was willing to sacrifice me for her approval. I told him that if he wanted to marry Jessica, he was free to do so. He could take her to City Hall have a small ceremony with her family, do whatever made him happy. But I was done being treated like a second-class citizen in my own son's life. I was done accepting scraps of affection from people who saw me as an obligation rather than a blessing. Marcus sat there for a long time, processing what I had said. Finally, he asked me if there was any way we could rebuild our relationship after this. He said he couldn't bear the thought of losing me, that he had made the biggest mistake of his life in letting Jessica convince him to exclude me. I told him that time would tell, that relationships, like trust, take years to build and can be destroyed in moments, that if he wanted to have me in his life going forward, he was going to have to prove that he valued me for more than just my bank account. He was going to have to show me that he was the man I had raised him to be, not the puppet Jessica had turned him into. After Marcus left, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely hopeful. For the first time in months, I had been completely honest about how I felt and what I needed. I hadn't tried to smooth things over or make excuses for their behavior. I had simply stated the truth and let Marcus deal with the consequences of his choices. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Jessica's voice, but it was different from any tone she had ever used with me before. Gone was the fake sweetness and the cold calculation. This voice was raw with panic and desperation. She said she had been trying to reach me all morning, that there were urgent matters we needed to discuss about the wedding arrangements. She said there seemed to be some confusion with the vendors, and she needed my help sorting everything out before the ceremony. This evening, I let her talk for a while, listening to her fumble through explanations and excuses. She kept referring to misunderstandings and communication problems, as if the cancellation of her entire wedding was just some kind of clerical error that could be easily corrected. Finally, I interrupted her and asked a direct question. I asked her if she remembered our conversation earlier this week, when she had told me I was embarrassing and irrelevant, and that I wouldn't be welcome at the wedding ceremony. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. She said that maybe she had been stressed and hadn't expressed herself clearly. She said that of course I was welcome at the wedding, that there must have been some misunderstanding about the guest arrangements. I almost laughed at the audacity of it. This woman, who had spent months planning my exclusion from my own son's wedding, was now trying to pretend that uninviting me had been some kind of miscommunication. She was rewriting history in real time, desperately trying to undo the consequences of her own cruelty. But I wasn't interested in her revisionist version of events. I told her very clearly that there had been no misunderstanding. She had made it perfectly clear that she considered me embarrassing and irrelevant, and that my presence at her wedding would be disruptive. I was simply giving her exactly what she had asked for. Jessica's voice became increasingly frantic as she realized that I wasn't going to be manipulated or gaslit into fixing the mess she had created. She started talking about all the guests who were expecting to attend, about her family who had traveled from out of state, about the photographer who was already on his way to the venue. I listened to her panic with a sense of calm satisfaction. Every vendor she mentioned, every detail she was worried about, represented months of my time, energy, and money that she had been perfectly willing to accept while treating me like an unwanted burden. Now she was discovering what it felt like when the foundation of your dreams suddenly disappears. When she finally paused in her frantic explanations, I said something that I had been thinking about all morning. I told her that she had taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between being wanted and being used. For months, she had made me feel wanted by including me in wedding planning, asking for my opinions, and accepting my financial contributions. But when it came time for the actual celebration, when my presence was no longer necessary for her plans, she had revealed that I had never been wanted at all. I had simply been used. Jessica tried to interrupt, to offer more explanations and apologies, but I continued talking. I told her that she had made a choice to treat me as disposable, and that I was simply accepting her assessment of my value. If I was truly as embarrassing and irrelevant as she believed, then surely she would be better off planning her own wedding without any contamination from my involvement. The call ended with Jessica in tears, begging me to reconsider, promising that she would make everything right if I would just help her salvage the wedding. But I had learned something important in the past few days. I had learned that my worth wasn't determined by how much money I could spend on other people's happiness. I had learned that being generous didn't mean I had to accept being disrespected. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's bad behavior. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was just the beginning. Jessica and Marcus were about to learn some very expensive lessons about consequences, respect, and the true cost of taking people for granted. They had made their choice, and now they were going to live with the results. The afternoon was just getting started, and I had a feeling that before this day was over, Jessica was going to discover just how relevant one embarrassing old woman could be when she decided to stop being taken for granted. That evening, I decided to take a long bath and reflect on everything that had happened. As I soaked in the warm water, I couldn't help but think about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few short days. 3 days ago, I had been a woman consumed with wedding preparations, stressed about seating charts and flower arrangements. Now, I was sitting in peaceful silence, free from the chaos that had been consuming my life for months. My phone continued to buzz throughout the evening with calls and messages, but I had turned the sound off. I wasn't ready to deal with whatever crisis Jessica was manufacturing. Now I had spent enough emotional energy on her dramatics, and frankly, I was enjoying the quiet. Around 8 o'clock, there was another knock at my door. This time, it was my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door and had become like a sister to me over the past 15 years. She was holding a bottle of wine and had that concerned look on her face that I recognized immediately. She said she had noticed all the cars coming and going from my house today, and that Marcus had looked upset when he left earlier. She wanted to make sure I was okay and to see if I needed anything. Mrs. Patterson had been one of the few people who had witnessed Jessica's behavior firsthand over the years, and she had never been shy about sharing her concerns about my future daughter-in-law. I invited her in and poured us each a glass of wine. As we sat in my living room, I told her the whole story, from beginning to end. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking her head or making small sounds of disapproval. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long whistle. She told me she wasn't surprised by any of it. She said she had always sensed something calculating about Jessica, something that didn't sit right with her. She remembered the bridal shower I had hosted at my house 2 months ago, where Jessica had made several comments about how different things would be once she and Marcus were married, how they would need to establish their own traditions and boundaries. Mrs. Patterson said she had noticed how Jessica would change her tone and demeanor depending on who was around. When it was just Marcus, she was sweet and accommodating. When other family members were present, she was charming and grateful. But when it was just us women, there was often an edge to her voice, a subtle dismissiveness that made Mrs. Patterson uncomfortable. She told me about a conversation she had overheard at the bridal shower, where Jessica was talking to one of her friends about how overwhelming I could be, how I needed to learn that this was her wedding, not mine. At the time, Mrs. Patterson hadn't wanted to repeat gossip, but now she wished she had warned me about what Jessica was really saying behind my back. As we talked, I realized that I hadn't been imagining the subtle signs of disrespect I had been picking up on for months. Other people had noticed it too, but like Mrs. Patterson, they hadn't wanted to interfere in family business. Now, I understood that Jessica's behavior toward me hadn't been a sudden change brought on by wedding stress. It had been building for a long time, carefully hidden behind smiles and thank yous. While she accepted my generosity, Mrs. Patterson asked me what I was going to do next, and I told her honestly that I wasn't sure. I said that for the first time in months, I was going to focus on myself. Instead of trying to fix other people's problems, I was going to take some time to figure out what I wanted my life to look like going forward. She raised her wine glass and made a toast to my newfound freedom. She said she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself, that she had watched me bend over backward for people who didn't appreciate me for far too long. She said it was about time I remembered my own worth. After Mrs. Patterson left, I felt a sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had lost myself in trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect mother-in-law, the perfect provider. I had been so focused on making everyone else happy that I had forgotten to consider whether I was happy. The next morning was Sunday, and for the first time in months, I didn't wake up with a mental list of wedding-related tasks to complete. Instead, I made myself a proper breakfast, something I hadn't done in weeks because I had been too stressed to eat properly. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee, feeling more peaceful than I had felt in a very long time. Around 10 o'clock, my phone started ringing again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. But when I answered, I heard a man's voice asking to speak with Mrs. Dorothy Williams. When I confirmed my identity, he introduced himself as Robert Chen, and he said he was calling from Riverside Manor. My heart skipped a beat. Mr. Chen explained that he was the general manager of the venue and that there had been some very unusual activity regarding the wedding booking that was supposed to take place yesterday evening. He said that after I had canceled the event, they had received multiple phone calls from people claiming to represent the wedding party, insisting that there had been some kind of mistake. He said that a young woman had actually shown up at the venue yesterday evening with several family members, demanding to know why the ballroom wasn't set up for their reception. When the staff explained that the event had been canceled by the person who booked it, she had become increasingly agitated and demanded to speak with management. Mr. Chen said he had tried to explain the situation to Jessica, but she had insisted that I didn't have the authority to cancel her wedding, that there must have been some kind of fraud or identity theft involved. She had actually asked him to call the police, claiming that someone had impersonated me to sabotage her special day. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. Even faced with the clear consequences of her own actions, Jessica was still trying to find a way to make herself the victim in this situation. She couldn't accept that the woman she had called embarrassing and irrelevant had the power to dismantle her entire fantasy with a few phone calls. Mr. Chen said he had called me because Jessica had given him my phone number, insisting that I would confirm that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. He wanted to verify directly with me that the cancellation had been legitimate and that there were no disputed charges or fraudulent activity involved. I assured him that the cancellation had been completely legitimate and that I took full responsibility for any fees or penalties involved. I thanked him for his professionalism in handling what must have been a very awkward situation. He said he had been in the event planning business for over 20 years, and he had never seen anything quite like what had happened yesterday evening. After I hung up with Mr. Chen, I couldn't stop thinking about the scene that must have unfolded at Riverside Manor yesterday. I imagined Jessica arriving in her expensive wedding dress, expecting to find a beautifully decorated ballroom filled with flowers and candles and elegant table settings. Instead, she would have found an empty room with no signs that a wedding had ever been planned there. I pictured her family members, who had probably traveled from out of state for the celebration, standing around in their formal attire with nowhere to go and no explanation for what had happened. I imagined the confusion, the embarrassment, the frantic phone calls trying to figure out how their fairy tale wedding had simply vanished into thin air. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy for the guests who had been caught up in this mess through no fault of their own. But then I remembered that Jessica had made the conscious choice to exclude me from witnessing my own son's most important milestone, while still expecting me to fund the entire celebration. She had created this situation, and now she was experiencing the natural consequences of her cruelty. Around noon, Marcus called again. This time, his voice was different. He sounded exhausted, defeated, and completely overwhelmed by the chaos that had erupted in his life. He said he had spent the entire previous day trying to help Jessica figure out what had gone wrong with the wedding arrangements. He told me that they had driven to every vendor, desperately trying to see if anything could be salvaged at the last minute. The photographer had been understanding, but firm about not working without payment. The caterer had already disposed of the food that couldn't be used. The florist had sold the arrangements to other customers when the original order was canceled. Marcus said that Jessica had been in complete denial at first, insisting that there must have been some kind of computer error or miscommunication. It wasn't until they visited the fourth or fifth vendor that she began to accept that the cancellations had been real and deliberate. He said the worst part had been calling all the guests to explain that the wedding had been canceled. Many of them had already arrived in town, booked hotel rooms, arranged childcare, and taken time off work to attend the celebration. Marcus had spent hours on the phone, trying to explain a situation that he himself didn't fully understand. His voice cracked as he told me about having to face Jessica's parents, who had been so excited about their daughter's wedding day. They had saved money they couldn't afford to lose to buy new outfits and travel to our city. Jessica's grandmother had flown in from California, despite her fear of flying, because she didn't want to miss her granddaughter's special day. Marcus said that Jessica had been alternating between rage and hysteria since yesterday afternoon. She had spent hours crying, then would suddenly become furious and start making demands about how to fix the situation. She had insisted that I must be having some kind of mental breakdown, that there was no way I would have deliberately sabotaged their wedding. But as the reality of the situation sank in, Marcus said he could see something changing in Jessica's eyes. For the first time since they had been together, she was seeing him not as a successful man who could provide for her desires, but as someone whose family had just cost her the wedding of her dreams. He said she had started making comments about how this never would have happened if he had been stronger, if he had set better boundaries with me from the beginning. She was blaming him for not controlling me, for not preventing me from having access to the wedding arrangements in the first place. Marcus told me that listening to Jessica's anger had been a wake-up call for him. He was seeing a side of her that he had never witnessed before, a side that was cruel and calculating and completely focused on herself. When faced with disappointment and embarrassment, she hadn't shown any concern for his feelings or any understanding of the pain this situation was causing our family. He said that yesterday evening, after all the guests had been contacted and all the vendors had been visited, Jessica had finally turned her full attention to figuring out how to make me pay for what I had done. She had spent hours researching legal options, trying to find a way to sue me for damages or force me to reinstate the wedding arrangements. Marcus said he had tried to explain to her that I had every right to cancel contracts that were in my name, that there was no legal recourse for her disappointment. But Jessica had become increasingly agitated, insisting that there had to be some way to punish me for ruining her special day. That's when Marcus said he had finally seen Jessica for who she really was, not the sweet, grateful woman who had been accepting my generosity for months, but someone who saw other people purely in terms of what they could provide for her. When I had stopped being useful, I had become an enemy to be defeated rather than a person to be respected. He told me that he had barely slept last night because he kept thinking about everything I had said to him yesterday morning. He was realizing that in choosing Jessica's approval over my dignity, he had revealed something about his own character that disgusted him. He had allowed himself to become the kind of man who would abandon the people who loved him for the sake of avoiding conflict. Marcus asked me again if there was any way to fix this situation, any way to rebuild what had been broken between us. I told him that I appreciated his honesty about what had happened, but that trust, once shattered, couldn't be glued back together overnight. I said that if he wanted to have a relationship with me going forward, he was going to have to prove that he had learned from this experience. I told him that the saddest part of this whole situation wasn't the money I had lost, or even the pain of being excluded from his wedding. The saddest part was discovering that the son I had raised to be a man of integrity had allowed himself to be manipulated into betraying the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. After our conversation ended, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved. For the first time in this entire ordeal, Marcus had been completely honest with me about what had happened and how it had made him feel. He wasn't making excuses or trying to minimize the damage that had been done. He was finally accepting responsibility for his choices and their consequences. But even as I appreciated his honesty, I knew that words were just words. If Marcus truly wanted to rebuild our relationship, he was going to have to back up his apologies with actions. He was going to have to show me that he had learned to value me for more than just my ability to solve his financial problems. That afternoon, I decided to go for a walk through the neighborhood where I had lived for over 30 years. As I passed houses where I had watched children grow up, where I had attended block parties and neighborhood barbecues, I realized how isolated I had become over the past year. I had been so focused on Marcus and Jessica's needs that I had neglected my other relationships and my own interests. I stopped by Mrs. Johnson's house, 3 doors down. She was working in her garden, and when she saw me, she immediately invited me to sit on her porch for some lemonade. Mrs. Johnson was 85 years old and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. She had watched me raise my children, had been there through my husband's illness and death, and had always been generous with advice and support. As we sat on her porch, I found myself telling her about everything that had happened over the past few days. Mrs. Johnson listened with the kind of patient attention that comes from decades of life experience. When I finished my story, she nodded thoughtfully and was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. She said that in her 85 years, she had learned that people will treat you exactly as poorly as you allow them to treat you. She said that kindness and generosity were beautiful qualities, but that they became self-destructive when they weren't balanced with self-respect and boundaries. She told me about her own experience with a daughter-in-law who had tried to manipulate and control her family relationships. Mrs. Johnson said she had learned the hard way that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's bad behavior, even when that person is family. She said that what I had done wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was simply honest. I had shown Jessica and Marcus the true cost of taking people for granted. I had demonstrated that respect isn't optional in healthy relationships, and that actions have consequences. Mrs. Johnson told me that she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. She said she had watched me struggle with Marcus and Jessica's demands for months, and she had been worried about how much of myself I was sacrificing to keep them happy. As I walked home from Mrs. Johnson's house, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a very long time. I was beginning to understand that what had happened over the past few days wasn't just about a canceled wedding. It was about reclaiming my own worth, about remembering that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. That evening, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I saw that it was from Jessica's mother, Mrs. Rodriguez. She said that Jessica had given her my phone number and asked her to reach out to me about the wedding situation. Mrs. Rodriguez said that she understood there had been some kind of family disagreement, but that she hoped we could work things out for the sake of the young couple's happiness. She said that Jessica was devastated about the canceled wedding, and that she was hoping I might reconsider my decision to withdraw my support. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. Even Jessica's own mother had been kept in the dark about what had really happened. Jessica had apparently told her family that there had been some kind of misunderstanding or disagreement, without explaining that she had deliberately excluded me from the wedding, while expecting me to continue funding it. So here I am, 3 weeks later, and let me tell you how this story ends. Jessica and Marcus never did get married that weekend, and from what I've heard through the neighborhood grapevine, they never will. Turns out that when you build a relationship on manipulation and disrespect, it doesn't survive when the money runs out. Marcus has called me several times since then, each conversation a little more honest than the last. He's finally seeing Jessica for who she really is. And it's not a pretty picture. She's moved back in with her parents, and last I heard, she's telling everyone who'll listen that I'm a bitter old woman who destroyed her happiness out of spite. But you know what I've learned through all of this? Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is to stop enabling their worst behavior. I'm 73 years old, and I refuse to spend whatever time I have left being treated like a walking ATM by people who should love me. I hope my story reminds you that your worth isn't measured by how much you can give to others, but by how much you respect yourself enough to demand the treatment you deserve.